One of the fallout of the IRIS Dena incident is that these waters will now be deemed to be less than safe. The moment the scope of the war widens and comes proximate to India, it has many repercussions, many consequences. Because India has a lot of interests which are at stake in the ongoing war between the United States and Iran. So, all those who have been leveling their, shall we say, kind of charges against the Modi government, my only observation is that, this is not binary. It is not black and white. The United States, the signal that it has sent by sinking the IRIS Dena is that it will act with impunity.
Hello and welcome. This week, the United States sank an Iranian warship in the Indian Ocean, killing over 80 people on board. The incident has widened the conflict that many thought would be limited to the Middle East. While the sinking raises many questions about the rules of international water, it also creates a unique problem for countries like Sri Lanka, India, and others. How should they respond? What is the protocol of rescue operations? And what makes them a party to the war? I have with me Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, the Director of Society for Policy Studies in New Delhi. He retired from the Indian Navy in early 2007 after 37 long years of service and has the rare distinction of having headed 3 think tanks. He was also the Director of National Maritime Foundation, which makes him an expert on this topic. Mr. Bhaskar, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Mr. Bhaskar, let me start off with the basics. What was your first thought when you heard the US had sunk an Iranian ship far away from the war zone in the Indian Ocean?
First thoughts, first response, I would say, when I heard the news is to say that yes, now the scope of the war has expanded, and from being limited to West Asia in a geographic sense, the war had now come into the Indian Ocean and also very close to Indian shores because the exact location of the firing of the torpedo and the sinking of the Iranian ship IRIS Dena took place about 40 to 50 nautical miles away from Sri Lanka, outside of Sri Lanka's territorial waters, but clearly in Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone, and also relatively close to the Indian peninsula. A number of thoughts, did cross one's mind. The fact that an SSN, which is a nuclear powered submarine, had been used to torpedo the Iranian vessel, a warship, was instructive in a historical sense that this was the first time after World War II, the end of World War II in 1945, that the United States was using a nuclear powered submarine in a combat attack mode to torpedo and sink an enemy warship, in this case, the Iranian one. So from 1945 to 2026 is 81 years, and it was a matter of historical interest. The other, of course, is the fact that the moment the scope of the war widens and comes proximate to India, it has many repercussions, many consequences. And the other thing which did cross one's mind at that time was that here was an Iranian ship, no doubt a target because the United States and Iran are at war. So, to that extent, it was within the framework of combat. And we are often told that there is no mercy in war. And if you find a submarine, particularly, acquires, that is the word that is used, acquires a target and is able to discharge or deliver its ordnance in a safe manner, then it will pick up the target, especially if the rules of engagement are very clear for the submarine commander. In this case, instructions must have been given that if you find any Iranian naval warship, a warship basically, a military platform, then you can engage it and neutralize it. I imagine this would have been the sequence of orders. This is conjecture on my part. But the context is also something that one was pondering over, which is that this particular vessel was in Vizag over the last fortnight, where it had participated in the International Fleet Review that India had conducted, which is a very major ceremonial event for any country. A fleet review is a very major event In our case, the President of India had graced the occasion. So there was a certain symbolism. The Iranians had sent their ship, like many other navies, and in a way they were guests of India. And they were going back. Now, the moment they leave an Indian port, in this case Vizag, and they are in international waters, then they're on their own. There is no question of any responsibility that devolves on India. But all these thoughts did cross one's mind.
Absolutely. You've touched upon so many things that I want to deep dive into. But first, just 20 nautical miles away from Sri Lanka, this is what Colombo has said, yet in the international waters, as you also pointed out. But Mr. Bhaskar, what does this kind of proximity mean in the high sea?
See, the fact that the United States was able to bring its submarine, a nuclear powered submarine, that close to any country, whether it's a Sri Lanka or an India, is an indication of the manner in which the United States was using its own military capability, in this case, an underwater platform that is nuclear propelled, to advance its own interests. I mean, clearly, the United States and the policymakers led by President Donald Trump would have arrived at a determination that they will sink an Iranian ship. Not that it had any relevance to the combat itself. Perhaps, here again, there's so much of conjecture. The United States could well say that they were given intelligence, or they had picked up intelligence that this particular Iranian warship was entering the Arabian Sea, and that it was loitering there to pick up or pick off or target American assets, whether it was an American merchant ship or an American naval ship or any other American asset in these waters. This could be one explanation. So, therefore, in any war, there is no mercy. So, you acquire a target, you neutralize a target. Neutralize is a very sanitized word for you kill the enemy, you kill the adversary. So, the US is justified in that sense to say that we are at war and Iran is the adversary, Iran is the enemy. But the question, this is slightly a kind of a nuanced point, that this is very proximate to two countries that have friendly relations with the United States. One is Sri Lanka, the other is India. And could this action have been done a little later? Meaning that as the Iranian ship was going closer towards Iran itself, or did the US submarine perceive any threat which compelled it to act? So these are the kind of questions that are raised, because one of the things about international law, particularly in the maritime domain, it lends itself to interpretation. One thing is to say that in international waters, any country is free to do what it wants. That is the global commons. States have jurisdiction in what is called as the territorial water, which is up to a maximum of 12 nautical miles. Beyond the territorial waters, where a country has jurisdiction over revenue, over criminal activity, smuggling, gun running, pollution, and health-related kind of issues, a country like India or a country like Sri Lanka can impose its own law in terms of the territorial waters and how the territorial waters are to be governed or managed. So, therefore, if a foreign vessel comes into territorial waters, it has to comply with the regulations and laws of the host country, in this case, Sri Lanka. Whereas in the EEZ, which is 200 nautical miles away, a different set of protocols and norms apply, and those are derived from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which is international. Some countries have ratified, some have signed. The United States, for instance, though it is the leading maritime naval power in the world, has not signed up or ratified the UNCLOS, whereas India has, China has, and so on. So a different set of norms apply, and one of the things that India has always stood for as advanced as a interpretation of the EEZ is that the EEZ is not territorial waters, it is international waters, but any foreign entity that enters, particularly a military platform, should not act in a manner that would be adverse to India's own interests, national interests. Now, again, this is my reading, this may be a minority view, but the presence of a foreign submarine, a nuclear powered submarine, would definitely be something that has to be monitored. Now, you remember that whenever a Chinese boat comes, a Chinese submarine comes into India, off Sri Lanka again, we've had many instances in the past. Sometimes it's a Chinese surveillance ship, sometimes it's a Chinese submarine. there is a lot of anxiety that is generated, saying, why is it there? What is it doing? Is it inimical to India's interests? And so on. So, in this case, if there is a submarine for Sri Lanka, definitely as a small island country, it does, in a way, tread on toes, tread on sensitivities. Was Sri Lanka informed? Very unlikely. Was India informed? Very unlikely. But this again is conjecture. I have no smoking gun. But these are the kind of issues that are raised or questioned that a major power, whether it is the United States now or maybe a China down the road, if they act with this kind of, the word that comes to mind is impunity, then where does this take us in terms of the management of the global maritime domain?
Sri Lanka is also being extremely cautious, as it should be, one is saying, in handling the entire situation. In fact, news has just come in that after a lot of deliberation, the country has allowed the docking of a second ship that was also in the international water, not in Sri Lankan water, but all the sailors have been evacuated, all the military personnel have been evacuated. While categorically Colombo is constantly stating that our position has been to safeguard our neutrality to the war while demonstrating our humanitarian values, can there come a position where countries are forced to pick a side because of the kind of ambiguity we are seeing in this kind of an attack?
The Sri Lankan response, one can understand their predicament at this point in time because, as per the rules of war, particularly when it relates to naval ships and naval platforms, today the United States and Iran are at war. I think it would be more accurate to say the United States and Israel are at war against or with Iran. All other countries have adopted a neutral posture. No country has joined the US Israel. They may be tacit or some kind of support. Maybe some of the European allies may be providing support. We don't know for sure. But in very broad terms, it is US plus one, Israel against Iran. In our part of the world, all countries, India, Sri Lanka, etc., have adopted the position of neutrality. So, therefore, for Sri Lanka, if they had allowed the Iranian ship to enter, the United States could well have interpreted this as a belligerent act and said that unless there was some emergency and the ship had a machinery failure or whatever and safety was involved, it had to come to harbor for repairs or whatever. Sri Lanka, at this point in time, particularly given the kind of characteristics we associate with President Donald Trump, who can see many acts of nations as a personal insult, they obviously do not want to get on the wrong side of President Donald Trump. So they don't want to be seen as a belligerent. So there would have been a bit of hesitation, uncertainty about whether or not they can provide any kind of support, help to the Iranian ship. Because I've also seen some reports suggesting that the Iranian ship was supposed to visit Sri Lanka after the International Fleet Review, and that when they approached Sri Lanka, there was some ambivalence, and that they spent 10 to 11 hours at sea instead of going back to Iran. I don't know if this report is accurate, but I've seen such references. My only point is that the ambivalence of Sri Lanka is understandable. One could even say it's justified, given the current geopolitical environment in which the world is operating. But providing humanitarian assistance, that, as I said, is the code of the sailor. So my broader point, and I wrote about this, when the incident happened, to say that what was the regional response? Just because they're Iranians, do we say that everybody steps back? And I raised this question hypothetically in one of the articles I wrote, saying that if we had flipped the situation and hypothetically an American platform was in similar straits and there were American sailors who had to be saved, what would the regional response have been? Again, my conjecture is it would have been perhaps a far swifter response, a more collective response. Maybe more nations would have got together. And my inference of this is that clearly a geopolitical dimension is at play when we are talking about humanitarian assistance, which to my mind, it may be a minority view, which to my mind should have been actually mediated by or regulated by the code of the sailor.
Is this new today's war tactics, or can we find like situations like this erupting in previous wars as well?
No, we haven't had too many such experiences, mainly because, as I said, the kind of naval engagements that we are now seeing are very few and far between. The last time that I can remember was 1982. There was something called the Falklands War. Now, I'm sure I can say with a straight face that 1982 is well before you were born. So, for your generation, that is history. The Falklands War is almost now 44 years ago. And at that time, the United Kingdom was in a limited conflict with Argentina. And they used their naval platforms. And yes, at that time also, submarines, warships were used, and there were survivors, in the ships that were sunk. After that, there's been no major engagement where a submarine was deployed in the tactical kind of format that we are now seeing. So that is why this exigency is a bit rare. Underwater platform, a torpedo, a surface ship being sunk. We did have a certain amount of naval engagement between Russia and Ukraine, but there was no submarine involved over there. And were any survivors picked up in the Russia Ukraine war? It had a different geographical scope. So that is why, this is, I would say, a kind of a infrequent occurrence, if you could put it that way.
Right now, we can't say for certain if Washington had informed New Delhi or Colombo prior, and I don't think any of the capitals will go on record to clarify that for us. But is there a protocol for it, or is it also open
No,
to?
basically the protocol is that a warship is at sea. It has its own operational task. In this case, the Iranian ship must have received orders from Tehran, from its own headquarters, about returning to Iran. And when the war broke out on February 28th, my conjecture again, all of this is conjecture, I have no smoking gun, would have received orders from its own headquarters about how to come back to whatever. Did they give them a task? Did they say pick up American targets? We don't know. But they were on their way, ostensibly going back to Iran. When they were hit, could they have informed anybody? Unlikely. But they could put out a distress signal. That is how the Sri Lankans also picked it up. I'm sure the Indian Navy would have also picked it up because we are the leading surveillance capable nation. We have the International Fusion Center in Gurgaon, and we are capable of monitoring all kinds of signal activity in the Indian Ocean region, and this was very proximate to us. A lot of other ships in the region also would have picked it up, the distress. The equivalent of an SOS, a radio signal, would have been put out. So much depends on who is able to respond in the shortest possible time frame. Even if there were some other ships, maybe there were some merchant ships that were close by that picked up the signal, but because it's a war and because it's a man of war, there would have been a certain amount of hesitation that do we want to get involved. So maybe the merchant vessels and their own companies that run the merchant ships would have already given some instructions and some orders about which waters they have to stay away from. Now, till February 28th, till the Iranian ship was sunk, the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the Malacca states were all considered to be safe. There was no international kind of notice, or the United States did not say that we are now going to extend the combat into the Indian Ocean. So it was considered to be safe. Now, one of the fallout of the IRIS Dena incident is that these waters will now be deemed to be less than safe. When that happens, insurance rates go up because the entire global merchant marine is basically predicated on the vessel and its cargo being insured, because we are talking about millions of dollars. If the insurance rates go up, then it's finally the customer, the man on the street in every country who is going to pay that higher price. Whether it's for food, it's for manufactured products, or any commerce. So that's how inflation kicks in. So this is not an isolated incident in that sense that is just a one-on between US and Iran. But the implications, the consequences, as I said earlier, could be very negative, not just for India, not just for Sri Lanka, but for the whole region and by extension the globe, because all international commerce now is so interlinked.
Prior to all of that, do you think India's naval infrastructure in the Indian Ocean would have detected an attack like this?
Again, this is a gray area, because underwater domain awareness and the ability to detect submarines in real time, you need a lot of infrastructure and capability. And even if the Indian Navy does have this capability, they would not disclose or share it. This is a very opaque area. So, particularly the movement of nuclear powered submarines. No submarine wants to be detected either. I mean, the real USP of a submarine is that it is undetectable, which is why, we talk about the ultimate deterrent being the nuclear powered submarine which remains underwater with a ballistic missile that has a nuclear warhead. That is the SSBN, the submarine nuclear propelled with a ballistic missile. The submarine that was used in this particular operation by the United States was an SSN. That is, it had no ballistic missiles that were capable of firing nuclear tipped missiles, but it was powered by a nuclear reactor, so it's called an SSN. Now, the submarine wants to remain undetected. But if it enters waters that are proximate, in this case India, or hypothetically, if a Chinese submarine or a Russian submarine were to go closer to the American waters, maybe international waters outside of America, the United States would deploy everything it has to try and detect that submarine. Will they announce it? No. But they have their own ways of signaling that the submarine has been detected. So, this question that you're asking, was India aware? Did the Indian Navy have the capability? I think it will have to be left as a gray kind of area. If the Indian Navy did detect the submarine, it's unlikely that they would announce it.
I ask you this because about 4 months ago, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi had declared that the Indian Navy is the guardian of the Indian Ocean. So many are questioning, like, how does this incident reflect on New Delhi then?
Again, I would say that we should not be too critical on that score
Mhm.
because, yes, Prime Minister Modi, if you remember, had earlier even spoken about Sagar. If you remember
Mahasagar.
in 2015 in his first term, and we all applauded. I mean, I remember writing very sort of, welcoming that move because it was good that India was getting over its sea blindness and finally a prime minister is giving it a certain amount of zip and, giving it some traction. And the acronym was security and growth for all in the region. Then in term two, or more recently, he expanded this to Mahasagar. And yes, there was that particular quote that you have just said where he spoke about India as the guardian and India as also as the preferred security provider. We have also occasionally described ourselves as a net security provider, preferred security provider, a credible security provider, and we have given, India's track record is exemplary in terms of search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and being the first responder. Time and again, from the 2004 tsunami to where we are now, 22 years later, India has always responded, and this is one of the USPs of India and the Indian Navy and the Coast Guard. Now, this time around, when you say you're the guardian of the Indian Ocean, can you prevent a major power from carrying out a military combat operation? The answer is no. India does not have the capability. Neither does India have the locus, even in terms of law, because we are getting into international waters. And India has been upholding this norm that international waters, countries, as long as they adhere to the protocols and norms, they are free to do what they want. And one of those protocols is that in international waters, a warship can conduct operations as per the rules, as per the norms that it has been given by its own political or whoever be the headquarters. Maybe a communist country would have a different frame of reference. Maybe a North Korea would have a different reference. Maybe Pakistan will have a different kind of command and control, mainly because the army is in the driver's seat, etc., etc. Now, therefore, I don't think India or Mr. Modi as Prime Minister, one can be critical to say that 4 months ago you said you are guardian of the Indian Ocean. Look what happened. That is not a valid, I think, criticism to be leveled because no country can claim to be guardian of the global common. I mean, we have three oceans. The Indian is the smallest. We have the Pacific and the Atlantic. Not even the United States can say that I'll be the guardian, whereby no other country can carry out any military activity in the international ocean because I have become the guardian. So I think that would be unfair to Mr. Modi.
Right. In a recent column that you wrote, you said, and I'm quoting, The sinking of the Dena ship should not become a polarizing debate in India. What did you mean by that?
Well, basically, there was a lot of, I would say, kind of political discourse. The opposition parties had made certain statements, and again, similar references by the Congress and other parties about India and that where is India's strategic autonomy, and they were our guests and they were just coming out of Vizag, and you should have stood up to the Americans and so on and so forth. Now that was getting into a very familiar kind of arid, zero sum kind of debate because India has a lot of interests which are at stake in the ongoing war between the United States and Iran. And India also has a bilateral relationship with the United States, which in the last 1 year plus since Mr. Trump has taken office, has also been a very difficult kind of a period for India and for Mr. Modi in particular. You remember that Mr. Trump has repeatedly spoken about his contribution to ending the India Pakistan war. That is something that India has not been able to accept. But at the same time, we know that Mr. Trump has, out of personal pique and his own, shall we say, characteristics, he has imposed tariffs on India. Now, a lot of people in the United States have written about the subject saying that if India had accommodated Mr. Trump on the India Pakistan war, perhaps the tariffs would not have been as harsh. Now, this again is an opinion by some people in the United States. So, what I'm saying is that for India, the India US relationship is very nettlesome, very prickly at this point. The second is tangibly, India has got a diaspora in West Asia. Now, as the war expands, whether it goes to Saudi Arabia, Dubai, airports are closed, or any other part of the West Asian region where Indian labor, Indian immigrants, so the Indian migrants are there as diaspora who are working in different jobs, some blue collar, some white collar. Their safety is a concern for the Indian government, for any government at any time of the day. I mean, you remember Mr. Vajpayee when he was Prime Minister. When the plane was hijacked, his immediate political priority was the safety of the passengers on that aircraft. So he also took some decisions which, in hindsight, may have been, shall we say, had an adverse impact on India's core security interests in relation to terrorism and the Pakistan factor and all of that. But that's hindsight. All I'm saying is that for India, oil prices. Today, oil prices are jittery. They have crossed $70. They are likely to touch 80. And they were below 70 before the war started. Now, every dollar that the Brent crude, when it increases, Brent is the term used for a barrel of oil. Every increase by $1 will impose a burden of almost $1 billion for India annually. That's a lot of money. So clearly, India cannot be, oblivious to all the other issues, and therefore we have to proceed with great caution. And if this great caution meant, not responding immediately or saying anything that would be deemed to be critical of the United States, either in relation to the war on Iran. After all, everybody has noticed that India has been very reticent and that Mr. Modi went to Israel. Mr. Modi, as Prime Minister, condoled with Saudi Arabia, when the missiles, Iranians had struck Saudi Arabia. But it took some time for India to actually condole or express any kind of condolence for Iran, whether it was the death of the Ayatollah Khamenei or the ship or the loss of life, even the school children who died. You remember that humanitarian.
Strategic? The delay?
I'm, beg your pardon?
I'm asking, do you think it was strategic, the delay?
Yeah, I would say it was prudence. One can use the term strategic prudence. But I'm saying, one, you must look at the facts. Some countries condemned the American action immediately. Russia, for instance. China took a day, but China also in the United Nations Security Council was critical. Many of the European nations were reticent. The only European leader who spoke up, in a very unambiguous way was the Spanish Prime Minister. So all I'm saying is that India is not alone. So all those who have been leveling their, shall we say, kind of charges against the Modi government, my only observation is that, this is not binary. It is not black and white. Should we have gone out there all guns blazing? And that's what I meant by saying that don't make this politically, zero sum. because I did see some references, and these days it's difficult, because you don't know. So much appears sometimes on social media, sometimes there are statements, sometimes there people just put out things and we don't even know if they are fake or otherwise. But the danger is there that a serious issue, which involves India's core interests, instead of the kind of, I would say, objective, informed debates that should take place in Parliament, such debates don't take place in Parliament these days. So as a result, social media, etc., platforms become the
Yeah.
option for views to be articulated. And then, the standard thing, there's a lot of heat and dust that is generated. There's very little light. And we know from experience that the more dust you generate, your sight is likely to become more and more, shall we say, blurred. So that was the broader point I was making, that, in this political kind of swirl, spiral, whatever, we shouldn't generate so much dust. Let these debates be done in Parliament. That will be a very constructive thing for India if national security issues are again discussed in Parliament in an objective way, but it hasn't happened in 20 years. So it's not as if one is saying that this is happening only on the Modi watch. Even during Mr. Vajpayee's time, 9/11 happened, and after 9/11, whatever may have happened, the United States India nuclear deal. If you remember, it was Dr. Manmohan Singh who was at the receiving end, and the BJP led the charge. We did not have much of a constructive debate, but at least we had a debate. Even that is not happening now. So that is why I'm saying that don't use social media and politicize the issue. National security is a grave, serious kind of matter.
Your dust analogy was very great. I might borrow it from you. Just before we wrap up, let's talk about the future a little in context to this attack that has taken place in the backyard of India. What kind of message does this attack have for India's naval future, especially when Indo Pacific, this word has become so common and recurring in every single country's foreign policy and its future and their strategies for the future? What kind of an message does this carry?
The United States, the signal that it has sent by sinking the IRIS Dena is that it will act with impunity. In a way, the signal is from Mr. Trump, as I see it, that might is right, and the United States will use its military capability, whether it's against an Iran in this case, or earlier, if you remember, Venezuela and the president who was abducted along with his wife, or, if need be, even within the domestic context of the United States. He is willing to use state power because he believes some immigrants or illegal immigrants are threats to American national security. He's operating where even American courts have said that some of his actions do not bear legal scrutiny. But he's still, shall we say, proceeding ahead in a very robust and enthusiastic manner. So, the kind of understanding is that earlier, every country, the application of macro force, this is a theoretical point, Max Weber had said this, that the use of force by a state has to be underpinned by legitimacy. Macro force. I mean, today every military, credible military, has macro force by way of ordnance, guns, missiles. You have all kinds of lethality. But the use of that force has to be underpinned and be used within the framework of law. My reading is that at sea now, the United States is demonstrating that, again, let me clarify this. The US sinking of the Iranian ship was an act of war. The US nuclear submarine approaching very close to Sri Lanka has also been justified as an act of war. The predicament for India in the Indian Ocean region and the Indo Pacific, by the way, no one has spoken about the Quad till now. The Quad has United States, Japan, Australia, and India. There was a sense that the Quad would be supporting a rules based international order. Now, the reduction of that will be that the rules will be set by the United States and all the others have to comply. Is that what we are signing up for? That is the question, not just for India, but even for the smaller states. I mean, all the smaller states are saying that if the war comes into the Indian Ocean, we are all affected. As I just mentioned, insurance rates are going up. Tomorrow, for some reason, if the Malacca is shut, just as the Hormuz, there's always this anxiety that the Hormuz will be shut, then the global energy sort of market will go into a terrible spiral and it will be difficult to come back to levels of stability, and then the whole inflation cycle kicks in. What suffers? Human security. Who will suffer? Those who are at the bottom of the ladder. So my constant concern is that all these should be refereed against human security. So the US action, tomorrow China will bring its submarine and say that we don't accept the Indian interpretation of the EZ. So what does India do? Then we have to acquire even more military capability and say that we will send our submarine off China. So is that the kind of maritime order we want? So I know there's a lot of debate these days going on saying that, come on, don't be so, you know, moral, and there's no place for morality. And this is the world of realism and realpolitik. I am a little hesitant to subscribe to that, because what is the end result? And do we at any point consider human security?
All right. Mr. Bhaskar, thank you so much for joining us on Hindustan Times. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. It's been a long chat, but all well. Thank you so much.
Welcome. I'm very glad to have this unhurried chat.
Yes, absolutely.